Today we're going to focus a little bit on the introduction to computer science and thinking about what code really is. So let's think about like writing instructions. So computer science is really thinking about how we're going to explain things to a computer. And if we relate that to what we do on a day-to-day basis, we write instructions for things like creating a batch of cookies. We need to write the recipe for that, and we can also like explain to people how to use an iPhone if someone hasn't used a phone before. These are all instructions that we're creating, and we communicate that to each other. But in this course, we're going to be communicating and telling a computer what to do. And to do that, we do that through writing code. So in this class, we're going to be focusing on a specific language. Just like how we speak multiple languages, um, a computer can also have many languages that it understands, and in this case, we're going to focus on one called Python. Python is an interpreted program and an interpreted language, and allows you to write different programs. So I like to think about this as like writing a to-do list. Essentially, we're writing code that tells computer what to do. So what's the whole point of code? If we back up in the scope of this course, our goal is for you to be able to learn the fundamentals of Python so you can do things like build web applications, create data visualizations, as well as different projects on your own. So that's our hope for you coming out of the program. And one thing we're going to focus on today is printing. So that's the most basic kind of command on a computer. So we'll explore that in the next segment. So this is where we're going to be writing all of our code. So you see here on the left side is where we're going to write the code, and we can click run and it will execute any of the code that we write. So let's try a statement here for print hello world and see what happens. So cool, it prints hello world. And exactly breaking down what we just did, we're essentially passing in a string into our print command. So print command says, whatever thing you feed me, I'm going to print that. And in this case, we feed it in hello world. And to break down what hello world in this case, we're going to call it of a string type. So hello world is of type string. And we define anything that is a string is anything that is enclosed in single quotes. So let's try printing out maybe numbers, or let's also print out decimals. Okay, let's try that. Okay, so it prints out numbers and decimals. What if we printed out a string and then we added a number? What will happen there? So it looks like there's an error here where we're adding a string to an integer, and it says you can only add strings to strings, and that's in line 6 where we're doing that. So the way we can fix this is by using a cast, and in this case, a cast is defined as converting from a type to a different type. So to kind of cover the types that we've explored, we've covered types string, which is anything closed in a single quotes, and integer. So integer is anything that is a whole number, 34. So in this case, since we're adding an integer to a string, it will give us a bug because we cannot do that in Python. So let's see, can we convert 5 to a string maybe? So in Python, it actually gives you an easy way to do this by using something called str parentheses parentheses. In this case, this means convert anything inside of the parentheses to a string. And in this case, it looks like we might want to convert one of these to a string, which would be 5. And so now what's going to happen is we're going to essentially tell Python the first step is convert 5 into a string, and then we're going to add, right? So this is essentially what we're doing, and let's print this out and see if the bug goes away. Great, so it does go away because we're now printing 2 strings. What did we just learn coming out of that little coding session? Well, we learned about casting, and casting is something that happens when we want to convert from a certain type to another. So in the case of the example that we did, when we wanted to cast 5, which is an integer, into a string, we use this function that allows us to do this. So these are things that we can do to make sure that we don't get into errors along the way as we're printing things out. And a review of the different data types that we covered in that last session was strings and integers. Strings is, again, anything that we declare with quotes, and integers is just basic whole numbers that we use that can be negative or positive. And also, something I want to cover is 2 new data types. One being floats. Floats, I think you can think of essentially as decimals like we use in regular math. So anything with a decimal afterwards, it could be 4.0, it can be something like 5.444. Those are all floats, and we're going to categorize these as this type. And we also have booleans. So booleans is kind of a cool name, but essentially stands for 2 different things. So a variable can be true or it can be false. And if a variable is true or false, it's a boolean. Something I want you to think of is variables. So if we think of let's take our brain out of thinking about Python and coding and think about containers. What do? They essentially store stuff, right? And that's useful, but that would be even more useful if we used it in computer programs, because what if we wanted to use 2 or the number 5 everywhere? Then would we have to put 5 everywhere? No, we can use the power of variables. So today we're going to introduce what variables are. Essentially, if you have a variable called my container and I want to store a value inside of it, let's say we're storing the number 5, then we can declare that in Python using a syntax, my container equals 5. And that stores a variable called my container equal to the value 5. And just a quick check-in, what is the data type, or what type is my container? It's going to be a variable of type integer because 5. Cool, so let's review a little bit about what variables and how we use variables in our program. So we can store different data types, right? We can store a variable that is equal to an integer, or we can say y is equal to a float and stuff like that. And essentially creating variables helps make our code cleaner. And we'll actually dive into that, what we mean by cleaner. But always make sure that when you're declaring a variable, which is kind of like setting a variable to some value, that you declare it in the right syntax. And that's very important in Python, because without the right syntax, your code will not run. So let's see that in action. So if we had my var equals 2 versus 2 equals my var, what do you guys think would be the valid way to do this? Yeah, so if we think about that, we are actually doing the right thing by setting the variable to the left side. And that's always just a proper syntax. And I think this also goes along with any other languages. There's always a syntax to kind of how we want to phrase sentences. These are all just rules that are embedded within the Python language. So make sure to follow these rules so that your code will run. All right, so now we're going to move on to a coding demo using variables and seeing how useful they are when we practice writing code. Now we're going to dive into how to write code with variables. So let's start out, let's kind of think about what we want to use. So I want to declare a name, a variable called name that will correspond to my name. And I want to print something out about me. So let's print a welcome statement that says, hi, welcome to developer program. Okay, so let's test this out and see. Does it work? Yeah, cool. So it adds 2 strings together and prints it out. And now let's try to declare an integer that represents how many movies you watched in the past month. So my movies watched count is going to be 10 movies. Right. So now let's figure out how many movies I've watched. So let's say I have watched Okay, cool. So I've watched this many movies this month. And what if I have a friend that is always going to watch like one less movie than me? So let's say print my friend watches one less uh, has watched um, movies. So here what I'm going to do is movies count minus one plus. So what am I doing here? So I'm basically saying my friend always watches one less movie than me, and I'm going to print that. So even if my movies count changes, my friend will always watch one less movie than me. So we're going to make sure we don't run into the bug of adding a string and an integer together by making sure to cast this into a string. And that way we make sure that we're not going to run into that error. So let's run that real quick and let's see. Okay, it says we cannot concatenate string here. Okay, that's because this is an integer. So let's change this here to a string with our cast. Okay, so now we casted this, and now let's run this and see. Yeah, so now it says I have watched 10 movies this month, and I forgot to put the space here. So let's make that space here. But what if I updated to say, instead of me watching 10 movies, now I'm going to watch 20 movies this month. So what will happen here is that Python evaluates exactly what happens in each step. And because movies watch count is reassigned to 20, now it evaluates, it figures out what the value of movies watch count is, and it takes 20 and it subtracts 1 to print 19. So this is kind of an application of how variables work. They can be like very flexible and easy because you're able to store these values inside of a variable that could be used in multiple different cases. Like in this case, we're using in 2 different statements. So a recap of today's lesson, we've learned a little bit about what Python is and how computers interpret code, and as well as using print statements and using and declaring different data types. So things like strings, integers, floats, and booleans. And we also learned how we can cast different data types to a different type using these string functions that we'll actually dive into later about what functions are. And we've also learned how to use variables in our code to help us store important values that we might use over and over again. And our demos allowed us to see code in real action. And later you'll actually explore that when we're writing code, we often get into finding bugs in our code where we would have to debug our code and fix the errors that come up. So I hope you guys had a good time learning a little bit about the basics of Python, and look forward to see you in the next lesson. Thank you.